Hello. I am Anthony Guarnieri, and I've been teaching here at CIS for over 20 years, 22 years to be exact. And I've been teaching out of all the departments. I can't be pinned down exactly. I've been teaching in the somatics department, the ICP department, ICP weekends, drama therapy, expressive arts, PsyD, and I've also done some summer programs. One which was, the last one I did was, I did a sand play workshop in Namaste Hall. I don't know if you knew that. There's a lot of history. I took all of my figures, my sand tray figures from my office from Berkeley, every single one of them over to San Francisco, and I had them all on tables and had sand trays all over Namaste Hall. 5,000. Thousands. Wow. I had a lot of help, but I said to myself, it was a very successful workshop. What I said was, I don't think I should do that again.
That's a lot.
It was a lot.
Setup.
But I've also been on the supervisory list and faculty for probably as long. It might have been a year or two after I started to teach. I teach child therapy, adolescent psychotherapy, human development in the family, sand play. I run my own training program, and virtually all of the students in my training program are from integral studies, although we've had, over the years, we've had just about every single graduate school in the Bay in my training program, which is the program for counseling in schools. I've been doing that. I'm the clinical director there for 20 years. And we've had great success with it. It's a terrific training ground for child and adolescent therapy. I've also supervised students in the other programs, Church Street Clinic, Pierce Street Clinic, and the new Clinic Without Walls in the Community Mental Health Department. So I've been here a long time. I've been in different departments and know the school very well. And Daniela has invited me to give this talk so that people can have a better view of the supervisors. In supervision, I supervise child and adolescent work as well as family work, but my practice is very diverse in all ways that we think of diversity. I see couples and adults as well, and I also do consultation with therapists who are approaching me for their work to do consultations on that level. In my training program, we are in schools that are 80% children of color, so we're really working with families who would not otherwise be seen for the most part. And that's true for a lot of private schools, whatever the demographic is actually. People don't go to therapy. Typically in the schools, it seems. I mean, there's some. So I'm a very diverse practice, and I'm happy for that. It didn't happen overnight. You have to make that happen. Okay, so my training and background are very diverse, including I don't just see things psychologically. I pay attention to as many bodies of knowledge as possible. As many dimensions of human experience as possible, looking at things sociologically, culturally, philosophically, spiritually, mythologically, and wanting to create the widest possibility, open space, whereby we can understand who we're spending time with, so that we can get the best possible direction in the work. And one of the things that I do in class is I talk about folks and people who are marginalized by what I refer to as the mainstream reference point, which becomes a tyranny. It's a tyrannical reference point. Everyone's bouncing themselves off of this reference point, and many, many people are marginalized as a result of it. And so people's problems aren't, and issues and concerns aren't just psychological issues. They're sociological, cultural issues, which means that they're political issues as well. I am very political in my practice. I do a lot of advocacy for the families I work with. I do advocacy for the students here at Integral Studies. I've helped a lot of students find placements, even if it wasn't in my program. and advocate for students who are having some trouble with the administration in some way to try and consult with them on how to negotiate that. And so the other thing that I would reference you to in terms of understanding my work is, and I'm going to say a little bit more because this is what this film is about, is for you to understand who I am and where I'm coming from. That if you Google me up, you'll see that I have a paper on Google. It's with the Imaginal Institute. It was published in Berkeley. It's a paper called Reclaiming and Revisioning Child Psychotherapy. And that really gives you a deeper sense of who I am and where I'm coming from. And it'll be helpful. In terms of my training and background, it's also very diverse. I really came up in what was, and still is, I guess, referred to as the human potential movement in the 60s and 70s. And so early on, there was a social eruption on many levels, politically, but also in the field of therapy and psychiatry, the anti-psychiatry movement. And that I was trained in the early emerging psychotherapies of the day, the humanistic and transpersonal psychotherapies, and training in body work, all kinds of body work, transpersonal studies, esoteric studies, spiritual practice and studies, and family work. So it was pretty diverse, looking at drama therapy, expressive arts, and looking at things in non-traditional terms, and not just being bound by the so-called prevailing wisdoms of the day. You know, psychotherapy, generally speaking, is very European-driven, Western-driven, and so it's in many ways relentlessly Eurocentric, and I try to pay attention to as many bodies of knowledge from other cultures as well, without being presumptuous about, because I'm not part of those cultures. I'm Eurocentric, but my studies and my practice have taken me to many other places. So in terms of my thinking about the work, many, many years ago, probably 30 and more years ago, and I'm looking at the camera more than the two of you.
You can easily just look at us, that's fine.
It's just like, oh, I'm looking there. But many, many years ago, when a student asked me, Anthony, do you believe in UFOs? I thought a second, I said, I can't afford not to believe in UFOs. And what's behind that is that I don't want to close down to any possibility. I don't want any proverbial stone to be unturned. I want to turn up every possibility in the service of understanding the person I'm working with. And I don't want to come off as too radical here in this film. Someone's coming in? Please, come on in.
Yeah, come on in, tell us.
We reserved a seat for you. We anticipated you.
Oh.
Your name is?
Oh, Cameron.
You can come in, Cameron. Hi, Amanda.
Hi,
This is Ilana, and this is Danielle.
Hi, Alana. Hi,
Nice to
Danielle.
From my point of view, I can't afford not to believe in everything. Even if I don't believe in something, I believe in it. I don't know how I do that. There are many bodies of knowledge that I have studied, and most recently, recent is a relative term in the last 10 or 15 years, astrology, but also tarot, or in Italian tarocchi, which is part of my own culture, my own Italian heritage and culture, and have collected many decks from, tarot decks from Italy as a way of trying to understand what this body of knowledge is about. And so it's important that you know all of that. And I was going to say, not to be too radical, I talk about this in class. I mentioned earlier that I spend a lot of attention focusing on who gets marginalized by the mainstream culture, but also who gets marginalized by the field of therapy. If we're thinking about psyche, if we equate that to soul, that psychology and the practice of psychology very often has nothing to do with psyche or soul. In fact, psychology is a defense against soul. And if we use a definition of psychopathology, which I don't really believe in very much, James Hellmann's definition of psychopathology might be something like, it's mine, but I adapted it from James Hellmann. When the yearnings and longings and the desires and the passions of the soul are thwarted, that gives birth to what we call psychopathology. And that if psychology gets in the way from people dropping into themselves and deepening into themselves, then psychology becomes part of the problem, and the practice of psychotherapy becomes part of the problem. My practice is very proactive. It's a proactive, depth-oriented model, which means I'm very practical. I'm very, very practical. One of my students once borrowed a book from me in my office who I was supervising. He was with me for 3 or 4 years. And he read the book and he came back. He said, "You're not a Jungian." He said, "You're a reality therapist." I said, "Oh, finally you got me." Because I'm doing behavioral stuff, I'm doing cognitive stuff, I'm doing charts, I'm doing measures, I'm doing all sorts of family interventions, along with looking at the big picture. I've never felt that doing practical stuff, practical approaches are mutually exclusive from a depth-oriented practice and point of view. We do get nervous about certain kinds of things, like one of my examples is, sorry for cat lovers, but I am a cat lover. I don't take 5 years to help a child figure out how not to set cats on fire. I would want to stop that in 1 day, let alone 1 month or 6 months. That we'd have to figure out how to do that, because that would be bad news. But in terms of understanding what's driving or fueling that behavior, that takes a longer time to figure out and to understand and to have some deeper perspective or change in all of this, which is another part of my philosophy and approach, which is, has a lot to do with perspective. Merleau-Ponty said many times, the most difficult thing to do is to decide what it is that you see in front of you. What is it exactly that we see? Whoa. Okay? And so I don't always know what I see, and I don't just pay attention to what I see with my obvious eyes. I pay attention to what I see with my unobvious eyes, not my third eye. I'm calling it, although it could be that, my unobvious eyes. I don't just see, I don't just pay attention to what I see, I pay attention to what's in the invisibles, what's in the spaces between. I'm not turning away from what I see or what I think I see, but if we had 10 different therapists lined up and asked them, what do you see in this one particular person, we'd have 10 different descriptions of what they see. That's it, what I mean. And so it really, we have to be very, very careful that we don't get seduced by our perceptions. And we have to be very careful that we don't get seduced by what we call psychopathology or what we call symptoms or problematic behaviors. We're seduced by them, and so when we're seduced by them, it narrows the field dramatically. And I was practicing in the day when you could still be the village therapist, when psychotherapy was a very kind of a scary thing in the culture. No one knew what to do with psychotherapy. The mainstream paradigm didn't know what to do with therapy. The corporate structure didn't know what to do with psychotherapy. Pharmaceuticals didn't know what to do with psychotherapy. Psychiatry didn't know what to do with psychotherapy. Although in the old days, psychiatrists were trained in psychology, and many of them were in therapy and analysis. The only 2 people I refer to now who are psychiatrists have been in therapy. I know they've been in therapy, and I know they've been trained in psychotherapy. Although there are other good psychiatrists, but these days, the last 20 years, we have the emergence of biopsychiatrists. It's only about pharmaceutical. And where was I here? By the way, if either of you have any questions, you can stop me at any point. I was talking about different points of view. Points of view. So what I mean, when I say do not be seduced by the problematic symptoms and behaviors, we see what we see, but we also see through. We see through to the deepest possible person. We see through to their qualities, their talents, their vocations, their callings, because that's what's longing to breathe free. And there are 2 kinds of history. In the practice of psychotherapy, we almost always pay attention to only one of those histories, which is personal history. There's personal history, and then there's soul history. We don't pay attention to soul history. We don't pay attention to what's going on in the interiority of the person enough in the widest possible way from my point of view. What I was saying earlier is that in the village, in the old days, that I could practice, you know, in the broadest possible way. Eventually what happened over time is that, well, I should date myself. When I was first practicing, I was practicing under the DSM-2. It was 1,000,000 years ago, the DSM-2. And it was this thin.
Wow.
As a camera, it was really thin. The DSM-1 came out in 1953, the DSM-2 came out in 1968, and the DSM-3 was the 78, 980, somewhere in there. And it then got very thick, and now it gets thicker and thicker. And so it became much more difficult to practice. The world got revved up in a much bigger way, got ratcheted up. So everything is faster, quick. We want fast, quick, now, change, progress immediately, evidence, okay? And if you don't have evidence, and if you go to an evidence-based workshop, I'm all for evidence and change, but it's not going to happen. Psyche has a mind of its own. It's not going to happen in the timetable that you think. You can't force psyche to respond. It will galvanize against you and protect itself. So the idea that if you don't have evidence after 6 months of practice, and this is what's said, that it's unethical to continue to practice. What do we do in cases where there's been severe trauma? We don't see evidence for 3 years. It takes that long for psyche to feel like it's okay to come out a little bit and deal with that trauma. I don't know what they would say about it. I'm asking whoever. Email me and tell me. We also have to be very careful, especially at the school with the very big language that gets used. I use this language, I know this language as best I can know it, but we have to be very careful about words like healing, transformation, as two examples that, boy, that's really, in many ways, the language of psychology, including at the school, not only at the school, is really presumptuous. I actually don't heal people, and I've been practicing for 35 years. I don't transform people. I don't really know what that means. And I also don't attempt to do that. I attempt to make a space where there's enough ambiance, hopefully, rapport. I can have a rapport. I don't like the word trust. I don't like the word safe. They're presumptuous. We don't need transformation. I have people who are consulting with me, and beginning and emerging therapists. Well, I saw this person for 4 sessions, and I think they trust me now. Really? Okay, you have a rapport now. I mean, you could be having an intimate relationship with someone for 2 years and you're not sure if you trust them yet. So safe, don't worry, it's safe here. Oh no, if I walked into a therapist's office and they said that to me, out, out. We don't know if it's whatever. So hope, I don't use hope either. I will use trustfulness, maybe. That's a different word. Hopeful. I'm hopeful that something can happen here. I won't even say safe enough. And very careful with language. I'm very strict about language in my own practice. What we say is important to people. Why do we say what we say to people? Why do we select the language that we use? What are the assumptions that are behind the language? What does the person hear when we say something? It's kind of like a Gary Larson cartoon, One person says one thing, and the other person hears something completely different. They hear it completely differently. We don't know what people hear. We have to be careful with how we come off. It's more complicated. If we all got in touch with, if 1 million people were watching this tape, and all 1 million people got in touch with how complicated and complex the practice of psychotherapy is, all at the same time, all 1 million people would run down Market Street screaming with their hair on fire. Incredibly serious. We have an enormous responsibility, and we can't rush things. And one of the biggest errors in practice is rushing to do things too quickly, not conceptualizing, not being with deeply, not presence. Presence is part of it, but a deeper being with and a real act of deep listening, wondering, allowing yourself to enter into your own reveries, allowing yourself to enter into a state of mystery and not knowing. But we're also thinking and trying to know as well. We're doing many different things in the practice of a broad and deep psychotherapy. So with perception, you know, what is it that we perceive, as I said a minute ago? And we're not trying to perceive with our obvious eyes, it's with our unobvious eyes, our other senses, our sixth sense, our intuitive sense, our animal sense, our what I call the creature. We're trying to understand primordial levels if possible. It's presumptuous, that's presumptuous too, but that's what I'm attempting to do, to really be open. And what I mean by that is that if we're going to practice therapy, and this is different than almost 100 years of psychodynamic psychotherapy, I believe that therapists haven't taken a certain step, that we have to be willing to throw ourselves unreservedly into the process and to be moved by the truth of the other person's experience. We have to be willing to be disturbed by the truth of the other person's experience. I think that's a step that psychotherapists don't take, because for 100 years, you know, there's training about boundaries, and we should have boundaries, but we've become phobic about boundaries now. I lost my thought, sorry. That we have to be willing to be moved by the truth of the other person's experience. We're keeping one foot outside of that so that we can have multiple minds here, which is another concept that I use. We have multiple minds, we don't rush in, we generate as many working hypotheses as possible. We're attempting to make the best possible relationship. I believe that healing and reparation and change takes place within the dynamic of the relationship through the activation of imagination. Through the activation of the deepest possible imagination. And so I really don't believe in psychopathology. I don't believe much in the DSM. It's a book and a collection of social constructs according to a small group of people's idea about what suffering is. It's a power document. When the DSM-3 came out, it became a power document. It was a major move to move away from the prevailing psychotherapies of the day. And there's a lot more I could say about it. I won't say it here. I give a more extended description of that in classes. Now, what I do believe in is I'm not turning away from serious problems. That I believe in what I call descriptive phenomenological diagnoses. We're describing who we're sitting with and who we're spending time with from as many different points of view as possible. And that it's a kaleidoscopic point of view. That's the title of this talk, Kaleidoscopic Supervision. It's a multifaceted, multidimensional complexity model. There's no particular prevailing viewpoint. I don't privilege anything. I certainly don't privilege the DSM. It's, you know, with the DSM, by the way, is another quick side note. When I say it has to do with power, it's a certain group of people get to say how we're going to name things. So that if the DSM were written by the professors here at Integral Studies, it would be a very different DSM. If it were written by the students, the graduate students, first, second, or third year graduate students, it would look differently. If the DSM were written by the marginalized groups that I was referring to, I didn't name specifically, as a lot of people are marginalized. What if the DSM was written by teenagers, or women, or people of color? What if it were written by immigrants? What if it were written by people who were in prison, or alcohol and drug addicts? It would be a very different DSM. So who gets to say? It has to do with power. Just to say a little bit more about that. But you do have to know it, because we have a world where that exists. We have to know it. We need to know the language of the world. But the truth is that I've been consulting with my colleagues for decades about our work with children, adults, families, and adolescents. And in 30 years, in all the contact I've had with my colleagues, not once did we ever invoke a DSM diagnosis. What does that mean? We're bad therapists? So anyway, in terms of perception, I wanted to get back to that. And this is from Howard McConaughey, that we're trying to perceive aesthetically and aesthetically perceive. we're looking at some of the deeper truths and the deeper movements of the soul, which isn't all glorious and fun and wonderful and sweet. If we're open up to psyche, then we're open up to the vastness of that, which means it all exists, it's all in there. And that what might be coming up might be extremely difficult and extremely gut-wrenching, and it might flatten a person. And I think it's at that point, because inherently when we're seeing somebody in psychotherapy, we're asking them to be open to the interior, their interior life. It's at that point when complicated material starts to come up, you know? That's when we send people out for medication. Just when that material is coming up. And that's a problem. That it's very difficult to see people through Dark Night of the Soul, what Dorokoff called a night sea journey. James Hillman said there is no psychotherapy, depth psychotherapy that takes place unless you take a journey to Hades, the underworld. Doesn't mean that all psychotherapies have to be a journey to the underworld. So you get a sense of this. I'm trying to fill out some spaces here. Any immediate thoughts, anything I'm saying? Questions, anything? Yeah?
About the DSM, doesn't it take the whole psychotherapist community to accept something like that? Like, why does it exist if it's not accepted by the community? I mean, how do they
That's a really good question. No, that's a terrific question, because so in order for it to be accepted, it has to be accepted consciously and unconsciously by the collective. And so even people who are opposed to the DSM have accepted it enough for it to be able to exist. I mean, people say the same thing about how did George Bush get elected? Enough people had to agree with it, consciously and unconsciously. That would be my long and my short answer to that. But you're asking, like, how does that happen? I have always thought, and I'm going to say it straight to the camera, that this school, and there have been some moves toward this. Some students have written, even in my current class, a child therapy class I'm teaching, somebody wrote a paper on an alternative view of the DSM. That, by the way, the DSM is written by all medical people virtually, not psychotherapists. Medical people. The practice of psychotherapy has nothing to do with medicine or the DSM or medical people. We refer out to medical people. I refer out to a lot of different people. I try to embody those bodies of knowledge too, or embrace those bodies of knowledge is what I mean. So I refer to occupational therapists, I refer to pediatricians, sometimes I will refer to a psychiatrist, a Western psychiatrist. I refer to Chinese medicine, acupuncture, acupressure, body work, martial arts, nutritionists, on and on and on and on. Chiropractor, chiropractors and homeopathists. I have a wonderful homeopathist in the East Bay. She works with children, Christine Civarella. She's terrific. There's a team here. There's a team approach. There's a broad view. It's not, I will see you. I mean, often I just see people. I don't refer to anybody, but I'm open to all the other bodies of knowledge as part of the practice. So, other questions? Thoughts? Because I could go, yeah.
I have just one other one. I'm currently in the Bachelor of Arts program, completion program right now, but I'm interested in working with veterans right in the future. And I just, the reason why I came was I was interested in how easily accepted your radical approaches have been to the mainstream, especially dealing with people like veterans. And then what does it look like when somebody's fully healed and like
fully healed?
To go, how do you?
I'll say with the camera on this one too. When anybody's fully healed, I would invite you to send me a postcard. It's an interesting view. To a certain group of people, oh my God, that's crazy stuff. Because I remember in class once, this is many years ago, the students were saying in the midpoint correction thing, when they give the professor feedback about how he or she's doing, and they said, oh, you have some radical ideas. I go, oh, what radical ideas? Because I take them for granted now. I go, oh, you said, and she's reading from her notes as a one student, you said there is no such thing as psychopathology. Oh, I said that? Wow. So, so some people say, oh, that's crazy. Other people say, it's the most natural thing in the world. I mean, not because they're radical too. Oh, that's not so radical, Anthony. And I'm not really trying to be radical. I'm actually trying to bring common sense into the practice of things. Stephen Mitchell, a well-known therapist in New York who did a lot of really important writing, who died way too early, said that psychotherapy or psychoanalysis is nothing more than embellished common sense. I'm cool with that. Good, serious common sense. So working with veterans, okay, it's the common, I know a lot about this because my son has worked with veterans for many years now. He's currently at the VA in Tacoma, Washington.
Wow.
And I've had very long discussions with him about approaches to working with veterans. And the prevailing approach and wisdom is immersion therapy, cognitive, brief, behavioral stuff. It's very short-term, it's like instead of going away from the trauma, they go right into the trauma, and they tell the story over and over again. I don't really know. I think it's called immersion therapy, but we could check that. And that's what he's practicing up there. He's also doing research up there, but there's a very good paper on combat trauma by Russell Carr. You can get it through the school here, through the library, the article search. It's a very good article. He is a Navy psychiatrist working with vets, and he said that approach that my son is using was not really being very effective. So he had contact with Bob Stallrow, who is one of the inventors of intersubjective theory, and he read his books on trauma. He said it's been extremely helpful to expand it out. Now I'm in favor of all the things that my son is using, but it's too narrow. It's too narrow. There should be another broader, deeper approach along with it. And so there's some literature out there now which can be very effective. You can email me if you want, by the way.
Okay.
If you want to
Russell
talk more.
Carr, listening.
That's Russell Carr, MD. And combat's in the title. Combat trauma maybe is what it's called.
Okay.
So what you should know about me, in addition to approaches, particularly because of children. Children have determined who I'm going to be as a psychotherapist and who I'm going to be as a supervisor. And that's another interesting thing. We have this tape here and this film, and people here listening to this. I'm a different therapist for different people that I see, and I'm a different supervisor for different people that I see. Yeah, there's overlap with all of them, but I'm not the same. If I were a supervisor with you, I'd be different than I would be for you. That it depends on who it is. We're trying to get the combination of things right, the alchemy right, to see what's necessary and so forth. And it's not like, you can only hear this much and you could hear this. It's not like that. So it's funny to be, there's no criticism of the tape. I'm happy to do the tape, but it's, I'm different for different people. And I'm a different therapist. I'm a different therapist with each person, but I'm also a different therapist from session to session with the same client. I'm different. And children have brought me to expressive arts, drama therapy, rolling around on the floor, pillow fight therapy, family work, fairy tales, mythology, spiritual studies. Children got me to study Jungian psychology, particularly. All of the children that I've seen, it's as if they all have a degree in all the departments from this school. They're geniuses. They're geniuses. And as I've often said, it's true with any client, but children are spiritual guides disguised as child clients. All clients are spiritual guides disguised as clients. And that there's a mutuality. I believe that in therapy and in supervision, that I enter that relationship, a supervisory relationship, with a mutuality of influence upon one another. To say otherwise is foolish. How could I say that I'm not influenced by somebody else? There's a mutuality of influence and effect and impact, and that I expect to learn as much or more from the student who I'm supervising than they might learn from me. That's how I enter into the relationship. Yes, we're in different roles. Yes, I have a lot of experience. Yes, I'm in this position of authority. And yes, I'm responsible for your practice and your clients. Technically, they're not your clients. They're my clients. I don't know if that's still true. Do you know that, Daniela? That the students' clients, according to the BBS, are really my clients, and you're able to see them, but I'm overseeing the practice. I don't know if that's still true. I remember that in ethics or supervision class many years ago. They said that. We're all looking at each other. What?
It's that you're, especially in practicum, they're working under your license, right, without a BBS number, but I don't know the exact word.
Well, postgraduate too. I supervise a lot of postgraduate, and where I'm not responsible is if someone who is licensed consults with me, It's not supervision at that point, it's called consultation, and it's a different designation, and I'm not responsible for that person's clients, but it's just a funny technicality. So it's an enormous responsibility. I'm going to look straight in the camera on this one too. It's an enormous responsibility for somebody to do supervision with the students, graduate level or postgraduate. I'm holding my heart as I say that because it's serious. And that there's enormous effort that goes into ensuring as best we can that you're doing the right stuff and seeing people. So it's a serious business with a lot of responsibility. So not only do I have different approaches, and even with my adult clients, by the way, I don't like the words we have, I don't like a lot of the language. This is another place where I'm with James Hellmann. A lot of the language, a lot of these diagnoses that we use, they're dead. They're deadened or dead. It's dead language. I want to use new language. I think we need to invent more adjectives, not more theories. That there are thousands and thousands of ways of being and approaches to doing supervision or therapy. There are, I don't know, 450, 500 different theories of therapy. And you can't possibly know them all. It's good to sort of study and have a sense of all the different approaches. We're always practicing. You never really want to get to the place where I'm now a psychotherapist. I'm certain of it. I'm certain of everything I say and do. Never really want to get too certain, and you always want to be a little bit anxious, which is a funny thing to say, but you don't want to be that unmoved, because then you're kind of deadened yourself. But the language I feel is deadened. The DSM diagnoses it's dead language for me. Every person I see gets a different descriptive phenomenological diagnosis. For the first time in history, no one's ever received that diagnosis before. And the way I see the DSM is, if I hold it in a certain way, and I'll get to your question, is that the DSM is a book of states of consciousness. It's not a book of diagnoses. It's a book of states of consciousness. What we call a diagnosis is a state of consciousness, and I prefer state of consciousness because a state of consciousness has more possibility of change. It's flexible. There's movement. The elements are coming through. It's not fixed and rigid. A DSM diagnosis is narrow, fixed, rigid, definite, no room for change. Do you ever notice that as soon as you get a diagnosis, no one's ever heard of getting undiagnosed?
Yeah.
We never get undiagnosed. Why is that? Well, I undiagnose people all the time now. And it was invented, it came in mutuality of discussion. I had a discussion with a 16-year-old girl who had been seen for 3 or more years, and she had been diagnosed many years earlier with ADHD. And so out of the discussion in the therapy session, we were talking about how, what were we talking about? She had this diagnosis, and I said, "Oh, do you still have ADHD?" According to her, she goes, "I don't know." I said, "Do you know what it is?" She goes, "No." I said, "Well," and I went through the criteria for ADHD. She said, "No." I said, "Well, it looks like you don't have it anymore." And so she said, "Really? Well, how could I not? I mean, I had that, so how could I not have it?" I said, "Well, this came out of nowhere. I could undiagnose you." She said, "Really? You can undiagnose people?" I said, "Yes." She says, "How can you do that?" And I was being playful with her. I said, "I have the power. I am Dr. Guarnieri." "Wow, well, undiagnose me." So I went like this. I went, "You are now undiagnosed." Out you go. Wow, I feel better already. It was great. I actually did this in a class. I was talking about this once before, and students started to do it, and it was incredibly effective and helpful for people. Remarkable. Brief therapy at its best. Undiagnosed. "Thanks, Doc. I'll see you in 10 years. Question, Danielle.
Oh, I was just wondering if you could give an example of like a
Phenomenological diagnosis.
Yeah.
Descriptive phenomenological. So what I mean by that is what I mean. Merleau-Ponty may not mean this, but I do. Is that I'm simply, or not so simply, describing what I see. Who I see and what I see and what I experience. I'm paying attention to, I'm describing what I see, I'm listening to what they say. The diagnosis is what the person says. They're saying, I've been feeling bad for the last 6 months, I feel terrible. Well, that's the diagnosis, they feel terrible. They're describing in their own terms, in their own human terms. I try to keep it in human terms. And that's the diagnosis. But I'm describing what I see. I describe them. My notes will reflect, what I see, literally what I see, how they look, their hair, their eyes, the color of their eyes, the costume, how they adorn themselves, how they sit. Given that I'm on all the departments, I pay attention to their body, to the somatics of things. Not just the obvious somatics, but I pay a lot of attention to what I'm experiencing internally. Because if I could say one thing that should be on this tape is I'm trying to help students to do two things, to develop their own unique instrument, their bodies, their heart and soul, because everything comes through, everything you study, everything you read, all your supervisions, it all comes through you and comes out in the most unique way possible. And so I'm helping students to find and develop their own unique idiom or instrument, whereby they can find themselves and do their own unique version of glorious work. For instance, I'm a Guarnierian. No one else could be a Guarnierian. Only Jung was a Jungian. Even he said at one point, he said, I'm not even a Jungian. He wasn't sure he wanted Jungian institutes. But you're what would you say? Koenigian.
There we go.
I'm a Guarnierian. So I help people to develop, as best I can, their own unique instrument and their own glorious idiom, because it all comes through. And so we're describing what we see, we're paying attention to what we experience. Some psychotherapy training states that what you are experiencing as the therapist is really the most important information. Okay? That's part of the descriptive phenomenological diagnosis. Okay? You could be sitting with someone and they're talking about, and they would talk about if they're a Giants fan, the San Francisco Giants, and suddenly in the middle of the discussion you feel nauseous. Where's that coming from? We don't just go, oh my gosh, lunch must have been really bad. I mean, it could have been really bad. But we want to think about, how did the client how did whatever's going on in the interaction between us create nausea in me? What happened there? That's in the invisibles. And also I was talking about the word client and patient. Psychiatrists have patients, psychotherapists have clients. Some psychotherapists and analysts will say patient. I don't like either of the words because of the connotations that come with them. Client is better than patient from my own point of view because it's just so businesslike. It's businesslike, it's businessy. And patient has all these popular connotations. But if you look at the etymology of the word, patient actually is a better word. Patient means one who suffers. A person who suffers. Client means the person is dependent upon you. I don't know that I want someone to be dependent upon me, although people can be. Because we could say there's healthy dependence, unhealthy dependence, however we determine that. Just like the word pathology comes from the Latin pathos. Pathos means suffering. How did suffering turn into pathology? There's something wrong with you. Medical model. Symptoms, diagnosis, treatment. Like that. It's cool in medicine, some aspects of Western medicine. Look, I'm not putting down any body of knowledge. I want to make sure I'm clear on that. If I get hit by a truck after I leave tonight, the first thing I want them to do is to take me to a Western emergency room. It's the best place to go. Don't take me to Christine Cibarella at the Hellmann Clinic in El Cerrito for homeopathy. That's later. Keep me alive first, and then heal me later. There's that word again, heal. Keep putting in quotes. I'll keep doing this. But so pathos turned into pathology, and if we look at the word therapy, the Latin of therapy is therapia, which means, in Latin, care of the soul. There's no popular connotation, there's no medical connotation to it. Therapia, care of the soul. And so we're in this position of caring for souls. It's big language. Soul is also a presumptuous word, as if I can tell you what soul is. I love language that nobody can define, really. Soul, justice, beauty, truth, okay? Very different, mystery, healing, transformation. Can't define those, really. We can't even define mental health. And we also profess to work with the mind. When I ask whether it's a small audience or a larger audience, does anybody know what mind is? Or where mind is? Can anyone tell me where your mind is? Oh, wait. Everyone points to their head. I don't know that my mind is in my head. How did mind get into head? We don't even know what mind is. In child psychotherapy, play. What is play? I don't know. What is mental health? What is love? What is sex? All this language that we can't really define. We can't define. We can't find it. Define. I combined two words. I like that. We can't define or find. So it's searching. But we have to be practically oriented to a certain degree. They're not mutually exclusive. When I work with alcoholics or addicts particularly, it's very practically oriented. It's forming a relationship and trying to invoke imagination and drop into to a certain point, because certain clinical or interior historical material you don't want addicts to drop into, because it might actually trigger relapse. Too much too soon. So I have to be careful. So that's a fine line. Let's see. I was going to say something else there. So I was talking about language. So many approaches. I'll circle back to that. Mostly, I pay attention to as many bodies of knowledge in terms of theory as possible. If someone asked me, I would say that I pay attention to contemporary approaches. Certainly humanistic and transpersonal psychology, that was my beginning stages, but then I studied self-psychology, intersubjective theory, relational theory, family therapy, body therapy, group therapy. So I have all these trainings and bodies of knowledge that I pay attention to theoretically that all come through me, and I enact those in the ways that I do. But it's contemporary theoretical approaches primarily. What else do I want to say? Thoughts? Any other thoughts or questions?
How do you adjust individuals to a society that's also in a state of adjustment?
Or in a state of disarray.
Yeah.
However we say that. A very good question. I teach out of the community mental health department as well. In my early years, I was at a community clinic for 6 years. My first 6 years of practicing was in a community clinic, so we weren't bound by these psychodynamic, psychoanalytic rules in the same way. I was seeing people out on the street, in juvenile hall, in prison, at psychiatric hospitals. We were meeting for lunch and having therapy over lunch. It was a community mental health model. It was social work, community mental health, psychodynamic, family therapy, consultation model. It was glorious, and it still remains my model for how I practice today. They're not mutually exclusive. So when I teach out of the community mental health department, they're asking, everyone should be asking that question, but they're asking that question because their positions will be, they'll be going into dynamic therapy, but also social work positions. How do we help people who have been hurt in whatever ways adjust to a society that they shouldn't be adjusting to? Even Martin Luther King said this in one of his speeches. He said, I don't want to help people adjust to this crazy world, but this is the world we're in, so it's a very fine line. I mean, it's the same when we're raising, having children, teaching children. How do parents bring their kids into the world? With the vagaries and the ills of the world and difficulties of the world? It's a very big question and an important one. It's not easy. But why do people come to us? Because they're suffering. They're in psychological conflict. They're in spiritual conflict. Suffering existed from day one. It's the first law of the universe in Buddhism. Suffering exists. In the Holy Grail, the first question that says, there are 3 questions in the Holy Grail. The first question is, what ails thee? You know, I might say, what's the story? Same thing. Or in Dante, in La Commedia. Dante wakes up one morning, and the first paragraph of this whole long book called La Commedia, with all of his trials and tribulations and journeys to Purgatorio, the first paragraph, it says, I woke up one morning and I was in a dark wood. What the hell happened here? Suddenly I'm thrown into some disarray. What do I do now? La Commedia is a beautiful book to read, which was on the bestseller list for about 300 or 400 years in the day. Is a beautiful model and model for transformation. There's that word again. I don't use big language, but I just used it again. Because he goes from, I woke up in a dark wood, through all these different spaces. He goes to the underworld, Purgatorio, hell, or hellish, and comes out some other side. That's why Jung paid a lot of attention to alchemy. It's a beautiful metaphor for change and transformation according to Jung. That's why I study alchemy. So it's a very difficult something. But suffering exists. That's why people are approaching this. They're telling us their story. And there's this range and continuum of suffering. They're coming to us, asking us to guide them and help them with their suffering. How can I be relieved of my suffering? How can I have a different perspective? How can I have a little bit of a change of heart? How can I get out of this? And how long will it take? And sometimes there's a big demand upon us. It's a really big question. It takes years to figure it out, and I probably will never figure that question out. But it's one we're always living. Where, like Rilke talks about living the questions in Letters to a Poet, Letters from a Young Poet. He talks about living the questions. We live the questions, and hopefully at some point we'll come to discover, and the answer will come to us. We can't demand or force the issue of coming up with an answer or certainty. That let's take it one step at a time and see where we might go. So I think that's all I would have to say.
Any other questions?
So I'm flying around the room here, and you get a sense of me. And one thing that comes through, which is in the spaces with me, or maybe not so in the spaces, I have my practice is, well, I talked about justice earlier, but I believe that all psychotherapy should embrace social justice in work. It's crucial, as well as all the other things that I mentioned. And I'm very passionate about the work. I'm on fire as much now as I was when I was first practicing. I'm very political. I don't like particularly what's happened to children. We have this phenomenon where I was practicing. The drugs that are prescribed for children today would not even been thought of 35 years ago when I was first practicing, let alone be prescribed. If they were prescribed, people's licenses would have been revoked. Wouldn't have even been thought of. We have hundreds and hundreds of more medications. We're mass medicating the culture. We're mass medicating children. We talk about the vagaries of the world. And how do we deal with that? I mean, how do we deal with the vagaries of the people who are attempting to help? Mass medicating with all these very strong drugs. I mean, children with anger problems are given antipsychotic medication easily. A million kids are on, or more, are on. You can check the statistics for yourself. Are given antipsychotics for their anger problems. All the psychostimulants that are given for attentional problems. I mean, I have all sorts of views about this, including the educational system. I think is not. I mean, how do we agree with? We're sending our kids to school, but we don't believe in the school. So what do we do then? What do we do? They have to go to school. Well, there are thousands and thousands of people who are doing homeschooling now, and going to creating some alternative, inventing schools, because I don't know. I was originally trained as a teacher years ago. I taught middle school and high school for some years, and I taught at the college that I graduated from for 4 years. And we were trying to do all sorts of alternatives to education in the day because we couldn't stand what we saw. That was 35 years ago. I think that it's hit critical mass. There's a massive resistance to school as it's currently being taught. it's almost like it's a kind of a collective resistance. It's a passive resistance to something that's not good for the soul. I mean, education has nothing to do with soul. It's rote, superficial, empty. It's only for a certain percentage of kids who are willing to throw themselves into academia in a certain way. But even for them, if you watch a film like Race to Nowhere, which is a film about the kids who are being run into the ground, this means small percentage, 10 to 15%. Kids who are highly academic kids who get into all these, amazing colleges, they're being run into the ground. They apply to 20, 25 colleges now. They have to be on 3 teams, be the editor of the school newspaper, write a book, invent a new invention. They're being run into the ground by it. That's not good for their soul either. So, a lot to say about that. And I do talk about it in my classes. So, now for real, I'm stopping.
Wonderful.
I promise. Thank you.